We're gonna have to cut this interview, Nick. I'm not going to go into any more detail.
I don't know how you would expect someone to feel. I mean, if they told you tomorrow you, how would you feel?
As Satan is concerned, I believe in a malevolent being. His description eludes me.
Damn myself for many years, because I can just imagine what her life might have been like.
In a way, yeah, I think it'd be a relief. I don't have to think about all these things anymore.
I know that without him and his strength that has sustained me, I couldn't have made it even thus far.
Going through my mind right now is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible and see what happens.
In 1982, Herrera was sentenced to death for killing 2 Texas police officers with a handheld projectile weapon. Anyways, Enrique and David were the names of the officers. Right before Enrique died, he actually identified Herrera as the killer after being shown just one single photograph while in hospital receiving treatment for his injuries. Because of this, Herrera was found guilty, and under duress, he also confessed to killing David. After being sentenced to death, however, Lionel filed a petition with the court claiming that new evidence proved that he did not actually commit either crime and that his brother was the killer instead. That actually turned out to be true, but at this point, Herrera had already been sentenced, and the Supreme Court ruled that evidence demonstrating innocence did not negate the sentence. And so on May 12th of 1999, Lionel was executed by lethal injection, but not before he said his final words: "I am innocent, innocent, innocent. Make no mistake about this. I owe society nothing. I'm an innocent man, and something very wrong is taking place." It was. He was completely innocent, but the government refused to change his sentence, and he died. Next on our list, we have the final words of Peter Curtin, aka the Dusseldorf Vampire, who was sentenced to death on July 2nd of 1931 for violating and killing almost 60 people. Not only that, but on occasion he would drink the BLOOD of his victims as well. Can't say that on here either. He was also referred to as the Dusseldorf Monster because of the rash and brutal nature in which he would impale his victims. On the day of his execution via guillotine, he said his final words, which were as follows: "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own BLOOD gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." So this guy was clearly messed up, so much in fact that after his head came off, it was mummified and sliced open so that researchers could study his inner cranium. Nothing unusual was found, the guy was just a psychopath, but his split head is now on display at Ripley's Believe It or Not in Wisconsin Dells, viewing included in the price of general admission. This is not an ad. Next, we have the last words of a terminal cancer patient submitted by a hospice care worker who believes he might have met the devil. During the days leading up to the patient's death, his mother visited often, each time urging her son to lighten up and accept Jesus into his heart. The man would repeatedly swing at his mother and tell her to F herself. On the patient's final day, his family was called into the room to say their goodbyes. The man's eyes glossed over, and so his mother leaned in and whispered, "Go towards the light, towards Jesus." With the man's dying breath, he opened his eyes, looked right at his mother, and said, "F your Jesus," before his head fell to the side. Moments later, however, his eyes opened again, but this time in horror. He screamed, "Oh shite, oh shite, oh no," and then he made some kind of guttural noise before falling back on his bed and dying. What he saw? No clue. I don't think I want to know. Next up, Mary Blandy, the last words of Mary Blandy. On April 6th of 1752, Blandy was sentenced to death after she was found guilty of killing her father. You see, she was a spinster, which at the time meant she was mid-20s and unmarried and aging by the day, because mid-20s was old back then. She was also in love with a captain named William Henry Cranstoun. Only problem was, he was already married. But despite this small detail, the pair went ahead and got engaged. When Blandy's father found out, he was livid and demanded that the two break it off. So William came up with a plan. He gave Mary Blandy a love potion and told her to give it to her father, saying that it would change his mind in regards to the engagement. She did, and her father died. Whether or not she was aware that the potion was actually just a bottle of arsenic remains unknown, but nevertheless she was convicted of the killings while William got off scot-free. On the day of her death, wearing a loose, billowing skirt, she was taken to the gallows where she uttered her final words, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, do not hang me high." Just pretty clever if you ask me. Next on the list we have the last incredibly painful words of Wallace Wilkerson. In the 1870s, Wilkerson was convicted of killing a man during a dispute over the outcome of a card game and sentenced to death by firing squad. On the 18th of May in 1879, his sentence was carried out. Now, generally when a criminal meets their death at the sore end of a firearm, they do so blindfolded, but Wilkerson had other plans, and so he refused the blindfold and instead traded it in for a cigar. His last words, "I give you my word, I intend to die like a man, looking my executioners right in the eye." Well, those were almost his last words, because the first round of projectiles actually failed to do the job. They hit him but missed his vital organs. Instead, Wilkerson's actual last words were, oh my god, they missed." He spent the next 20 minutes struggling to breathe before he eventually died. The execution was later rightfully criticized by a writer for the local paper who wrote, "The French guillotine never fails." Next, we have the final words of Wesley Allen Dodd, who in 1989 pled guilty to the violation and killing of 2 young brothers in Washington and the killing of another young man in Oregon. This was after Dodd had already been arrested several times on other violation charges and sentenced to court-ordered therapy. In a strange turn of events, he actually denied the appeal of his case, and so he was sentenced to death at the gallows by his own request. When the rope was placed around his neck, he spoke his final words. I was once asked by somebody, I don't remember who, if there was any way violation offenders could be stopped. I said no, I was wrong. And then he died. The last words of Carlos Grandos are next. In 1998, Carlos was arrested after impaling his girlfriend, Catherine Jimenez, who he was living with at the time, and her son with a blade after an argument had broken out in which Catherine had asked him to leave. Catherine survived, but her son did not. For his crimes, Carlos was given the death sentence. On January 10th of 2007, the sentence was carried out via lethal injection. Catherine watched from behind a glass window just a few feet away from Carlos. Before he died, he looked at her and said, "Kathy, you know I never meant to hurt you. I gave you everything, and that's what made me so angry. But I never meant to hurt you. I'm sorry." What really gets me about this one, and what makes it really creepy, is the fact that Carlos took his last living moments as an opportunity to patronize Catherine after having repeatedly done so over the years. I feel like this story kind of serves as a warning to get out at the first sign of warning signs in regards to these kinds of situations and behaviors. Next up, we have the last words of a dying man submitted by a nurse who had been caring for him in his final days. The nurse said that one night they were called in to check on a man. They entered his room and he looked at them and said, "The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God is with you." And after that, the man suffered an intense seizure and he died with his eyes wide open and a menacing grimace plastered over his face. In the days leading up to his death, the man had often been heard yelling about the devil and screaming over and over, "Get out of here, the building's gonna blow." The nurse said that they didn't think much of it at the time, but they haven't been able to think about much else since. Next up, we have a story submitted by another nurse, this time working in a cardiac ICU unit. It's a short story, but a chilling one nonetheless. The nurse had been treating a patient with a pulmonary artery rupture. He seemed stable at the time, and so the two had been joking around with a few other nurses on the floor. All of a sudden, bright red BLOOD began flooding and spewing out of the patient's mouth in alarming quantities. He looked up at the nurse and said his final words, "Why is this happening to me?" The patient patient died soon after, and the nurse who posted the story wrote that the incident still haunts them to this day. That one actually gave me goosebumps. Ugh. Finally, we have one more story submitted by a nurse detailing the last moments of a patient's life along with the patient's final words. Of course, that's the title of the video. In the days leading up to an old woman's death, she had flagged a nurse down to say, "You know where I'm going." The nurse asked what she meant, and the old woman replied, "You know where I'm going, and it ain't up." The nurse, beginning to understand what the woman meant, asked her if she wanted to speak with the priest on staff, to which the old woman just replied, "It's too late for that," before continuing to walk down the hallway of the nursing home. A few days later, while eating dinner, the old woman started screaming and yelling, "Fire! Fire! There's fire everywhere!" And she never spoke again. And then she died shortly after, leaving few to wonder where she went after she did. I guess she should have spoken to the priest.
Michael J. Adams was an astronaut who flew the X-15 rocket plane, a cutting-edge aircraft at the time. His last flight was on November 15, 1967. He reached an altitude of 266,000 feet, but when the nose of the X-15 veered off course by 15 degrees as he descended, the aircraft went into a dangerous spin. It was chaotic, with the plane experiencing extreme forces, over 15 Gs vertically and 8 Gs laterally. Just 10 minutes after launch, Adams announced, "I'm in a spin," before the X-15 broke apart, killing him instantly. After the accident, search teams tried to recover evidence from the wreckage. The cockpit camera was retrieved, which recorded the flight, but the film inside was missing. Eventually it was found though, allowing the investigators to learn exactly what happened during his final moments. Final ILS-24 was the last radioed transmission sent by Elliot C. before he died in a tragic accident along with fellow NASA astronaut Charles Bassett. On February 28, 1966, an accident occurred at Lambert Field in St. Louis, Missouri. Elliot C. and Charles Bassett were on a routine training flight of a NASA Northrop T-38 Talon. C was piloting the jet, and Bassett was in the rear seat, while another T-38 carried their backup crew, Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan. After taking off from Ellington Air Force Base in Texas, they ran into trouble. As they approached St. Louis, they missed their landing marker and overshot the runway. C tried to land on the southwest runway. As he descended, the plane dropped too far left, and he activated the afterburner to gain altitude while turning right. Unfortunately, at 8:58 a.m., the jet crashed into the roof of McDonnell Aircraft's Building 101, where the Gemini spacecraft was being assembled. The T-38 lost its right wing and cartwheeled into a parking lot. Both astronauts died instantly from the impact. C was found ejected from the cockpit, still strapped to his seat. Bassett's body was discovered later in the building. The crash also injured 17 McDonnell employees. American test pilot Michael Aylesbury died in 2014 during a test flight, his last words being "pitch up" moments before the accident. On October 31st, 2014, the VSS Enterprise, a Spaceship Two experimental space vehicle, crashed into the Mojave Desert. The flight, known as Powered Flight 4, was the first powered test in 9 months and aimed to test a new hybrid rocket engine using nylon fuel instead of rubber. The VSS Enterprise was piloted by Peter Seibold and co-piloted by Michael Aylesbury. After being released from its carrier aircraft, VMS Eve, the space plane fired its engine as planned. Just 11 seconds into the flight though, the Enterprise broke apart, creating a massive debris field stretching 35 miles. Witnesses reported seeing a parachute before the crash. Tragically, Aylesbury was killed in the incident, while Seibold survived with serious injuries and was transported to a nearby hospital. Seibold managed to escape the wreckage and was parachuted to safety. It was a rare given the circumstances. He reported that the aircraft broke apart around him, but his parachute deployed automatically after he unbuckled his seat. In 1966, during the Gemini 8 mission, David Scott radioed to ground control after a seemingly successful dock, stating, quote, "Flight, we are docked. Yes, it's really a smoothie." Little did he and Neil Armstrong know that things were about to be the exact opposite of smooth. Gemini 8 was launched on March 16, 1966. It was going to be a historic flight, the first ever docking in space, where the Gemini spacecraft would link up with an Agena target vehicle. The plan was for astronauts David Scott and Neil Armstrong to spend 3 days in space doing experiments and a spacewalk. Well, shortly after docking, Scott and Armstrong noticed the spacecraft was starting to roll uncontrollably. Armstrong tried to stabilize using its thrusters, and it stopped for a moment, but then it started rolling again. Out of communication range with mission control, they had to make a quick decision. They realized that the high spin rate could damage the spacecraft or even cause the Agena to explode, so they undocked from it. But without the added weight of the Agena, the Gemini began to spin even faster. Unfortunately, they'd used up a lot of their re-entry fuel while stabilizing the spacecraft, so they had to cut the mission short and make an emergency landing. Scott later praised Armstrong, stating the guy was brilliant. He knew the system so well, he found the solution, he activated the solution under extreme circumstances. It was my lucky day to be flying with him. On July 16, 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano's spacewalk of the ISS was cut short when he reported that water was filling up his spacesuit. As he was working outside, water started leaking into his helmet. Total nightmare scenario. But not only was his helmet filling with water, but it was floating around and blocking his vision, made it hard to hear because of the weightlessness in space. Parmitano ended up spending just over an hour outside, making it one of the shortest spacewalks in ISS history. He later said, "I started going back to the airlock and the water kept trickling. It completely covered my eyes and my nose. It was really hard to see. I couldn't hear anything. It was really hard to communicate. I went back using just memory, basically going back to the airlock until I found it." Fortunately, he made it back inside the ISS safely, but the experience, understandably, left him pretty shaken. Charles Conrad famously described the Apollo 12 mission as, quote, "a small step for Neil, but a long one for me." And at no time was that more clear than when not one, but two lightning strikes hit the shuttle on takeoff. Terrifying. On November 14th, 1969, Apollo 12 launched from Kennedy Space Center at 11:22 a.m. Things were looking kinda ominous though. There were dark clouds overhead, heavy winds. I'd be uneasy getting on a plane in conditions like that, let alone a rocket heading to space. Just over 35 seconds into liftoff, the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning, causing a voltage surge that knocked out all three fuel cells, leaving the spacecraft to run solely on its batteries, which weren't powerful enough for all the systems. And then a second lightning strike hit 52 seconds into takeoff, taking out what's called the 8-ball attitude indicator. They were worried that the lightning might have affected the command module's parachutes. It was too late to really do anything about it though, so they just kept that information from the crew. Luckily, in the end though, the parachutes deployed just fine, and the Apollo 12 mission was a success. Theodore Freeman was an American astronautical engineer and test pilot who became a NASA astronaut in 1963. Sadly, he was the first astronaut to lose his life when his T-38 jet crashed on October 31st, 1964. On that day, Freeman was flying back to Houston after some training in St. Louis. The flight was delayed thanks to fog, which turned out to be partially responsible for the accident. Now, as he approached Ellington Air Force Base, a flock of geese was reported in the area. One of these geese struck the left side air intake of his craft, causing the engine to flame out. The engine out, Freeman tried to land on the runway but realized he was too low and might hit nearby military housing. So he banked away from the runway and prepared to eject. But unfortunately, because the jet was nosing down, he ejected nearly horizontally. His parachute failed to deploy in time, and he died on impact. Freeman knew the risks that came with being an astronaut though, and despite these risks, he was passionate for his work. To quote him, "We don't look on this as dangerous work. It's about the most fascinating job I could imagine. Too much pain. Do something please to kill the pain." These were the last words spoken by Valentin Bondarenko, a Soviet fighter pilot who was selected as a cosmonaut in 1960. March 23rd, 1961, he was on a 15-day endurance experiment inside a low-pressure altitude chamber in Moscow. The chamber had an atmosphere that was at least 50% oxygen, making it highly flammable. On the 10th day of this experiment, after finishing all his tasks for the day, Bondarenko removed some monitoring sensors from his body. Then he started using an alcohol-soaked cotton ball to clean his skin. He tossed it aside without thinking, and it happened to land on a hot plate he was using to brew tea. The cotton ignited, and when Bondarenko tried to put out the small fire with his sleeve, he caught on fire almost immediately. The chamber was under pressure, and it took nearly half an hour for a doctor to open the door to get to him. By the time help arrived, though, Bondarenko had suffered severe burns over most of his body. He died from shock 16 hours after the accident. In honor of his contribution to space exploration, though, a crater on the moon's far side was eventually named after him. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center at 11:38 a.m. 58 seconds into flight, 9 puffs of smoke were spotted coming from the rear solid rocket booster. Cold temperatures had compromised the O-rings, which were meant to seal the joints, allowing hot gas to escape, causing damage to the craft. As Challenger continued its ascent, a flame burst through the joint of the booster, and just moments later, the right booster detached from Challenger, leading to a catastrophic explosion. Pilot Mike Smith's last recorded words were simply, "uh-oh," as the shuttle began to break apart. Debris scattered over the Atlantic Ocean. February 1st, 2003, the Columbia Space Shuttle, commanded by Rick Husband, was in the middle of its re-entry when it broke apart in the sky, killing everyone on board. The shuttle had sustained damage to its thermal protection system during its launch, which allowed superheated air to enter into the left wing, and this caused serious issues as the shuttle descended, leading to increased drag and loss of control. Around 8:53 a.m., the shuttle started shedding all this debris. By 8:58, the shuttle systems began reporting multiple failures. Just a minute later, communication with Columbia was abruptly lost. Rick Husband's last recorded words were a simple "Roger, before the connection cut off. Columbia broke apart in the atmosphere, resulting in the loss of all 7 crew.
Starting off this countdown, we have Brittany Murphy. Brittany Murphy was an iconic actress in the late 90s to early 2000s. She was well known for the movies Clueless or Uptown Girls, and it was such a tragedy that she had to pass away at such a young age. She had such a bright future ahead for her. Sadly, on December 20th, 2009, Brittany passed away. Shortly before this, she had called her mom and said, "Mom, I'm dying." Imagine hearing those words coming out of your daughter's mouth. It just breaks my heart. It said she passed away from pneumonia, an iron deficiency, and from having multiple drugs in her system. In our 9th spot, we have Elvis Presley. Alright, so Elvis Presley. Do I even have to explain who Elvis was? Like, if you don't know who he was, then wow, you might be a little too young to watch these videos. I'm kidding, but he was just a huge superstar. On August 16th, 1977, Elvis had gone to the dentist in the morning and then returned home to his fiancée. At some point, he told her that he was, and I quote, "going to the bathroom to read," in which she replied with, "Don't fall asleep in there. It was a joke." And he replied with, "Okay, I won't." Those were his last words. She then proceeded to have a nap, and a couple hours later she woke up to find that he never came out of the bathroom. He had passed away in there. This just makes his last words so haunting. What's even worse is that he proposed to her on January 26, 1977 in that bathroom, the same place he passed away. In our 8th spot, we have Prince, a huge rock legend that was known for his elaborate stage outfits and amazing voice and vocal range. Prince was performing almost every night in high heels. As a result, he developed bad back and hip problems, leading him to need some serious painkillers. He was prescribed a fentanyl patch to help with the pain, which later would contribute to his overdose on April 21st, 2016. Before he passed away, he had been on the phone with his lawyer. Prince assured him that he was fine. He said he was doing perfect. And then he said, "Okay, I'll call you soon." Prince never called back. He passed away shortly after. Moving on to number 7, we have Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix was an American singer-songwriter and musician. To this day, he's considered one of the most influential electric guitarists. Now, according to his girlfriend, Jimi spent his last day in London with her. She claimed that he had made a meal for them at her apartment at around 11 at night, accompanied with a bottle of wine. At around 1:45, she drove him to his friend's house and then picked him up a couple hours later. The last words he ever spoke were to his girlfriend,
and they were "I need help bad, man." The next morning, she found him unconscious and unresponsive. He passed away shortly after. In our 6th spot, we have Kurt Cobain. I just realized that there are a lot of great musicians on this list. Like, it's sad that they left this world so soon. Kurt Cobain was a singer-songwriter for the band Nirvana. Sadly, in 1994, he took his own life. He was only 27 years old. His last words were found in a note that he left. In the note, he quoted Neil Young's lyrics. He said, "It's better to burn out than fade away." And those were his last words. And from them, we can kind of interpret that he wanted to go out being famous instead of being forgotten. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel, of course, you know her for being the founder of the luxury brand Chanel, which is still huge to this day. I wish I could afford it. I can't. Sadly, she passed away on January 9th, 1971 from old age. She was 87 years old when she passed away, and she was getting pretty frail. On the day of her death, she went out for a long drive. When she returned home, she wasn't feeling well and went to bed early. Her final words were to her maid, and she said, "You see, this is how you die." That's pretty dark if you ask me. What's freaky is how a lot of these celebrities knew that they were passing away. Like, they can feel their body giving up on them or something. Somehow they just know that it will be their final day. Moving on to number 4, we have Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was an American film and TV actress. She started off as a dancer for a number of theater companies and then went on to be on Broadway. From there, her career took off and she was in a number of impressive films. Sadly, on May 10th, 1977, she passed away from a heart attack at the age of 73. While this was happening, apparently her maids were praying for her, and her last words were telling them off. She said, "Damn it, don't you dare ask God to help me." And then she passed away. Wow, I bet those maids felt really bad after that. Coming in at number 3, we have Michael Jackson. Now, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the King of Pop's death. But in the end, he passed away after overdosing on propofol, the drug he was addicted to and constantly had his doctors administer him. The last thing he ever said was "more milk." Milk was the name he had given propofol because of its milky appearance. So his last words were asking for the thing that would later kill him. In our 2nd spot, we have Princess Diana. On August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana got into a car with her rumored boyfriend. However, the driver of the car was very intoxicated and ended up driving at a very high speed when he lost control of the car and smashed into a pillar. The driver and her boyfriend died instantly. The paparazzi that had been following the car watched this tragedy unfold before their eyes. Diana suffered from a concussion, broken arm, cut thigh, and massive chest injuries. When the paparazzi came to her rescue, they heard her say, "My God, what's happened?" That's the last thing she said. She passed away later in the hospital as a result. And in our number 1 spot, we have Chris Farley. Chris Farley was an American comedian and actor known for being on Saturday Night Live or in movies such as Coneheads and Wayne's World. Farley's last day was December 17th, 1997. The weekend prior, he spent it partying and doing drugs with a lady of the night named Heidi. On the Wednesday, the two were doing some heavy drugs. When she got up to leave, Farley apparently said, "Don't leave," and then he passed out. She took a photo of him and then left. That's so sad. The last thing he ever said was him pleading for her to stay so that he wasn't alone. The next day, Chris's brother found him still lying on the floor close to the door. He was found clutching rosary beads. He had passed away from drug overdose. And I bet Heidi felt really bad after that, and also because she has a picture of him. Starting off this countdown, we have Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is famous for co-founding Apple, of course. But sadly, in 2003, he was diagnosed with an unusual form of pancreatic cancer. On October 5th, 2011, almost exactly 8 years since he was first diagnosed, he lost his battle to cancer. According to his family, Steve's final words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said it 3 times. Then he lost consciousness and died several hours later. They also said that he first looked at his sister Patty, then over to his children, and then to his partner, and then over their shoulders past them. And that's when he said, "Oh wow." So what was it that he saw over their shoulders? Was it the white light everyone talks about? In our 9th spot, we have Steve Irwin. But before I go any further, please make sure to give this video a big thumbs up because it it really helps us out. Steve Irwin, otherwise known as the Crocodile Hunter, was known for getting up close and personal with dangerous creatures like crocodiles or venomous snakes. It seemed like nothing scared him. Sadly, on September 4th of 2006, while filming a documentary called Ocean's Deadliest, Steve got pierced by a stingray's barb. The barb went right through his chest, piercing his heart. Crew helped him onto the boat as he started to bleed to death. One of the crew members, Justin, tried to comfort Steve and said, "Think of your kids, Steve. Hang on, hang on, hang on." One of the crew members, Justin, tried to comfort Steve and said, "Think of your kids, Steve. Hang on, hang on, hang on." Steve just looked up at him and said, "I'm dying." And that was the last thing he said. And at number 8 we have Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was an American singer and actor that won a number of awards, like an Academy Award, 3 Golden Globes, multiple gold discs, and a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award. But after being very ill for a number of months, he had a heart attack and died shortly after. His wife was by his side comforting him while this happened, and she revealed that his last words were, "I'm losing it." It's so sad and scary. Moving on to number 7 we have Frida Kahlo. Famous artist Frida Kahlo was said to be one of Mexico's greatest artists. She began painting mainly self-portraits after a bus accident that left her severely injured. From there, her artwork became well known, and they were exhibited in Paris and Mexico before her death. About a week after her 47th birthday, on July 13th, 1954, she passed away. Her last words were in her diary entry, and it read, "I hope exit is joyful, and I hope never to come back." Now, it's said that she passed away from a pulmonary embolism, but others believe that she took her own life. At that point in her life, she did have a couple of failed attempts. This was because she had to have her right leg amputated below her knee from a gangrene infection, and that really affected her. It's really sad that her final words are basically saying how she wanted to die and then never come back. In our 6th spot, we have Paul Walker. Paul Walker was an actor known primarily for the series The Fast and the Furious. He passed away on November 30th, 2013 after attending a charity event. Paul's last words were, "We'll be back in 5 minutes." This was said to Jim Torp, a man working at the event, but sadly, Paul never returned back. He got into a car that his friend was driving, and a little while later, they crashed into a concrete lamppost and 2 trees before it burst into flames, killing Walker and the driver instantly. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with John Lennon, an amazingly talented singer and songwriter who was the founder and co-lead vocalist for the Beatles. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon was assassinated outside of his Manhattan apartment. The man that took his life was a fan that traveled all the way from Hawaii. Apparently, he didn't like Lennon's lifestyle and how he was portraying himself to the press. On that night, he waited outside of Lennon's apartment and then shot him 4 times in the back. Lennon's last words were, "I'm shot, I'm shot." He repeated it twice, and that was the last thing he ever said. Rest in peace, John Lennon.
Witnesses told police Lennon was shot near the door to his apartment building as he and Yoko Ono returned from a recording studio.
I saw John and Yoko get out of the limousine. They walked into the gate.
Moving on to number 4, we have Mozart. Mozart was a very well-known and talented composer. He got into music very early on in life and was extremely gifted. But on December 5th, 1791, he passed away at the age of 35. And of course, there's a bunch of theories as to how he died. Some say he was poisoned by his rival, but it's believed that he died from a disease that led to a severe fever, causing him to slip into a coma. But we still don't know what disease led to his death. Anyways, one of the last things he ever said was, "The taste of death is upon my lips. I feel something that is not of this earth." I mean, that's very artistic, but also it's sad because he knew that he was going to pass away soon. In our 3rd spot, we have Nostradamus. Nostradamus was a very famous man known for being a prophet. Apparently, he could see into the future, and honestly, a lot of his predictions have come true, so people believe that he was legit. Well, Nostradamus actually predicted the exact date of his death. On July 1st, 1566, he made sure to tell his priest all of his last predictions, because he knew that the next day he was going to die. The priest ended the conversation saying, "Until tomorrow," and he replied with, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." he died that night. His last words to another person were, "Tomorrow I shall no longer be here." That's pretty freaky. In our second spot, we have Amy Winehouse, another super talented individual. Like, her voice is incredible. It sends shivers down my spine. But on July 23rd, 2011, Amy passed away from alcohol poisoning. The night before her death, Amy Winehouse met with her doctor and told her that after 3 weeks of being sober, she started drinking again because she was bored. The conversation ended with Winehouse saying, "I don't want to die." And that was one of the last things that she ever said. The next day, the bodyguard found her laying in the same position as she was a couple hours prior. He checked on her, and that's when he knew she was gone. Now, this one breaks my heart because she literally was so worried about dying, and then the very next day, the very thing that she feared happened. And in our number one spot, we have Heath Ledger. Heath Ledger was a well-known Australian actor known for starring in movies such as 10 Things I Hate About You, Brokeback Mountain, and The Dark Knight. Sadly, on January 22nd, 2008, he passed away from an accidental prescription drug overdose. The night he died, he was on the phone with his sister who was worried about him. He told her that he was going to take sleeping pills on top of his prescription for a chest cold because he couldn't sleep, but she warned him not to. His last words were, Katie, look, it'll be fine, you know. I just need to get some sleep." Sadly, he never woke up.
Number 10, I'm scared. A Reddit user wrote of their experience saying he was an elderly gentleman with a worsening congestive heart failure who was incapacitated. His wife put him in hospice and he was comfort measures only. I was at the nurse's station and I can hear him starting to gasp for air. I walked into the room and he was struggling to breathe. I put my stethoscope up to his back, but I already knew what was happening. His lungs were full of fluid. I sat him up in bed and he stared at me, eyes wide open, head tilted slightly back, with a facial expression of full-blown panic. I'm scared. Immediately after he said the words, his oxygen mask started filling up with pinkish red frothy foam running down his face and dripping onto his gown. He was dead within minutes, and all I could do was watch him. Now that sounds absolutely terrifying, and I can't imagine the pure terror that old man felt, and it's a shame that the last thing he felt was panic. Number 9. Tell my mom. This online user said I'm not a nurse but an EMTB on the 911 unit. We got a call about a hit and run and cops were on the scene first. Some guy and his girlfriend had gotten into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with him running over her, then backing up over her. She wasn't doing well and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up and she kept mumbling, "Tell my mom, please tell my mom." Naturally, I figured she was asking us to let her mom know that she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, so I put it out of my mind as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived and they didn't get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on the scene. She had gotten accepted into college. And that's what the girl wanted her mom to know, that she got into college. Now that's just an absolutely heartbreaking story and I can't imagine being in their shoes. Number 8. Don't let me die. This story is more heartbreaking than scary, but an online user said, when I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while being on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed to be intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die," and I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU, and a few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me, saying, "Please don't let me die." Number 7. I'm sorry. This user said, my buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient, probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check her vitals. They were normal. She woke up, smiled, and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I didn't marry you. My family wouldn't let me. But I will now, I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Now her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we're black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago because she was looking right at him when she spoke. IDK is weird. All I know is that is so sad and that her last words were filled with regret. Number 6. Angel. This Reddit user said, "I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. We would have long chats and joke around with each other, but in the last 2 weeks of his life, he stopped talking completely and didn't really acknowledge conversation directed at him at all. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. I told him I was leaving for the night and that I'd see him the following day, and he looked me in the eyes and smiled so genuinely and said, 'You look like an angel.' I thought it was so sweet because he had not seemed lucid in weeks, and he died the next morning. It really messed with me." Now that would mess with me too because wow, but at least he found some comfort within this nurse. Number 5. What day is it? Okay, so this post doesn't really follow the guidelines of this title, but hear me out. This user said, "I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough." Backstory, my dad had MS. He'd had it since he was 18, diagnosed at 20, married my mom at 24, had me at 29, and died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice. He and my mom were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mom jokingly said, "You know, Tim, the best thing you could do would to be die on a Wednesday. That way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday so more people could come." Now the morning we got the call that it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked that if the day had any significance. It's not even 6 a.m. yet, so mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was and they tell him it was the 20th. He looked irritated but accepted it. That morning he asked what day it was and they said it's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favorite nurse's hand, and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend and we did just as he and mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To his dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him. Now that's honestly so sweet and I can't believe it worked out that way, and I can tell that their dad was a great person. Number 4. I'll die. Now this story is just freaky. It goes, came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who'd been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning but OBS all fine, ECG fine, so I just asked someone to sit with him to keep an eye on him, reassure him for me. He gets worse, really panicky, heavy breathing. He's on his side in the fetal position. Doctors will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get there and that he won't face the other way. OBS still all fine at this point, but he's more agitated, so again, I suggest he move position for comfort, and that's when he says, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll die." He repeated this a few times to me, and he arrested literally as the doctors walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew, and me too. Number 3, dying alone. This online user shared this story saying, "I work in a long-term care and one of my residents was dying from lung cancer. We knew it was going to happen any day and she did too, and she repeatedly stated that she didn't want to be all alone, so all Friday night nurses took turns sitting with her, and when I came in Saturday morning, they asked if I would sit with her. I worked in recreation. She was such a sweetheart and had no children, but had a niece who hardly visited, and when we called Friday, basically she said, call me when she is dead. Anyways, this lady was laboring to breathe, in and out of consciousness, but would always squeeze my hand if I squeezed hers. Finally, I whispered in her ear, "The nurse just told me your niece is on the way." She died less than 5 minutes later. She just wanted to know that someone was coming, but her niece never came. Now this is just really heartbreaking, but I'm glad someone was with her when she passed. Number 2, help me. This Reddit user tells a story that stayed with them forever. They said, "My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. I was trying to check her vitals and she was super agitated and had been all day. She managed to bend her IV pole somehow. She was ripping her gown off and sheets off the bed, and she'd yanked her heart monitor off. I was trying to start a blood transfusion but needed to get her vitals beforehand, which was impossible because she wouldn't stay still long enough for any of it to read. I'd given her a sedative for what we thought was anxiety and was praying it would kick in soon. She kept grabbing my arm saying, 'Come here, look at me, help me,' with a fear in her eyes that I will never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, 'I'm trying,' which I of course wish was something comforting instead. Then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she shut her mouth, then snapped her eyes wide open but totally glossed over. She took one last breath as a coworker was helping me while I called the code." And coming in at number 1 is the Hat Man. The last one here is definitely the creepiest. This Reddit user said, "A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said the man in black is here. She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said he's in all black and he's got a top hat on. Then she whispered, 'And his eyes are red,' while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind the CNA, like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that." Yeah, that room would creep me out forever, because what do you mean the man in black wearing a top hat is here? I would freak out if I heard that.
Starting us off at number 10 is Cursed Like a Sailor. One nurse who works in the ICU took to Reddit under the name CABC, posting the weirdest thing a patient ever said to them. They start off by saying, quote, "I had a gentleman who was DNR on comfort care. He was demented and was cursing like a sailor. He seemed to have moments of clarity and when asked to see his brothers, who were both dead." Now, that all by itself, not creepy whatsoever. I mean, nurses are definitely used to an array of colorful language, considering how much of their days are spent with people in immense pain. But after a particularly worrisome heart rhythm, his rate started speeding up exponentially, and she began to think that this might be the end. At that moment, Reddit user says, quote, "The patient looked at me in the eyes and said, 'What's your name?' To which I replied, 'My name.' He asked, 'What do you do here?' 'I'm a nurse,' I replied. The dying man was quiet for some time, then out of nowhere he just said, 'F you,' and died in silence 20 minutes later. I mean, what was the reason? Coming in at number 9 is Paint the House. Maybe it's just me, but I think the biggest question people have about dying is, will they get to see those who have already died wherever it is they are going? It's the whole what really happens to us when we die that likely plagues most of us. So maybe this isn't the darkest on the list, but it's still a bit odd nonetheless. In a post made by a now deleted Reddit account, the nurse explained one of the strangest and simultaneously comforting things they've ever heard. The post said they overheard a conversation between a patient and their grandchild. The grandfather was fading fast, but he turned to his granddaughter and said, quote, Dar, I can't hang around. Your grandma needs me to paint the house." The granddaughter was just about to remind him that her grandma had been dead for several years and there was no house to paint. Then he died right there and then in front of her. The Reddit user claims that while a bit strange, she likes to think that he really was living in his afterlife with his wife painting their house. Next up at number 8, he knew. This one comes from Reddit user Paper Rainbow, and they start off by saying that they came into work for an early shift and were handed over to a patient who had been experiencing high levels of anxiety, including a panic attack the previous evening. Reddit friend continues on saying that all morning the patient had still been quite anxious, but was showing nothing that was concerning and that tests were still coming back fine. So they were merely there to sit with him and make sure he felt okay. But then
things started getting weird. The patient starts getting worse, breathing, lying in fetal, and looking like they're on the brink of another panic attack. So the Reddit user tries to reassure them, saying doctors will be here in 10 minutes and to please lie on his back so that he can better monitor his breathing. He refuses, saying, quote, "I won't make it until they get here and I won't face the other way." Still, the patient continued to be really agitated, so this time the nurse suggested to move for comfort. That's when he said, quote, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll be gone." The patient repeated this phrase over and over and over. Then sure enough, as soon as the doctors walked in, he turned to the other side and died. I mean, that can't have just been a coincidence. Coming in at number 7, I understand. In a now deleted Reddit account, one nurse posted saying that although they had heard many strange or concerning last words from a patient, that this one was the creepiest. They started off by explaining that the man was obviously on his deathbed and that they knew he didn't have much time left as he was experiencing renal failure. Apparently the patient has been pretty quiet for some time, but then all of a sudden his eyes got wide and he loudly yelled, "I see a bright light. Horses. No eyes. No, no, no." He then fell asleep for a bit, and Reddit user goes on to say that he woke up, looked up, and with his last breath he said, quote, "I understand." And he died right at that moment. The user finished off by explaining that, quote, "We know in the medical field that these situations are provoked by a cascade of neurotransmitters in disarray due to tissue and organ failure. But I sometimes have my doubts, and perhaps we are seeing more than we are led to believe." Coming in at number 6 is the Grim Reaper. Hallucinations can apparently be a normal occurrence for patients nearing death due to the high amount of pain meds they're on. But that doesn't mean that what they say still can't haunt you to your core, mostly cause you never really know what the truth is. One Reddit user named Koyena posted about a patient they had had one night that said, quote, "The devil has been in my room all night, but don't worry, God is with you." Then that night, after a horrible and brutal seizure, the man died with his eyes wide open and a creepy grimace plastered across his face. They explained that prior to the seizure, the man had been screaming at the devil in their room and kept shouting over and over, "Get out of here, the building's gonna blow." Now, thank God, nothing actually ever happened to the building, but still, the last thing this person ever said was that they were being haunted by the devil, and then they died with a haunting expression on their face. So definitely unsettling. Coming in at number 5, DNR. Reddit user Callie Asari posted a few years back about one DNR patient they had had that really affected them for a long time after they died. So first off, DNR, if you don't know, stands for Do Not Resuscitate, which means that the patient has opted out of any and all life-saving treatments. Reddit friend starts off by saying, quote, "The patient was on a high dose of morphine and hallucinating. She would alternate between grasping for things not there and trying to climb out of bed. She was too unsteady to walk, so my job was to sit in the room and make sure she was safe. The patient apparently continued trying to get up, so the nurse simply asked, 'What do you need? I'd be happy to get it for you.' To which the woman grabbed her arm, pulled her in close, and said very angrily, quote, 'Kill me.' Safe to say the nurse was expecting her to ask for some water or something. Obviously the nurse did not kill her, but she did die soon after, and that was the last thing she said before she died. Pretty creepy, if you ask me. Coming in at number 4, a confession. Okay, so this one isn't from a nurse, it's actually from a surgeon, but it's really creepy, so I'm still counting it. There is a lot you might expect someone to confess on their deathbed. Cheating scandals, admitting that they hated something or someone, that they were a drug addict, or maybe there was a secret undercover agent. But this story posted to Reddit by the user Really Unbelievable a few years ago honestly sounds like the start of every plot of a true crime doc I've ever heard of. They say, quote, "Not sure if this is creepy, but a man on his deathbed kept repeating, 'The body is in the woods next to the oak tree,' over and over and over again until he passed." Yes, that is creepy, I would say. Was this man confessing to killing someone and hiding the evidence? Apparently police got involved and they ended up searching the area the patient had mentioned but never recovered any evidence of a body. True, it could have been nothing, but that doesn't really seem like something you'd say without any grounds to back it up. Coming in at number 3, hemorrhaging. This next story was by a now deleted Reddit account and might be one of the goriest stories I've ever heard. The patient was hooked up to a trach, which is a tube connected to your neck that helps you breathe when the patient is not able to do so themselves. A Reddit user says, quote, "I walked up to her and saw bright red blood just started shooting up the vent circuit and immediately obstructed it. This wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this, so they turned to the surgeon and explained that the patient was hemorrhaging, to which the doc apparently replied that it was just a little bit of blood, assuming the nurse was referring to the access site in her groin. The nurse knew that there was no time to waste, so they popped off the vent, but it was worse than they had even imagined. Blood started pouring out of her trach, mouth and nose at an exceeding rate until a pool about 6 feet in diameter circled them on the floor and they were covered from chest down. They said after a few minutes the patient used her last bit of strength to look into Reddit users' eyes and just say, quote, "Let me die." Coming in at number 2, fire. As I've mentioned, many nurses or medical staff chalk up strange late-stage behavior to pain meds or a way to cope. But this one story by L_3 had her questioning her own sanity for a few days after. Quote, "I had an old lady flag me down in the hallway a few days before she passed, and with her emaciated face and bulging eyes, she said, 'You know where I'm going.' The nurse asked her what she meant by that, to which she replied, 'You know where I'm going when I die, and it ain't up.'" I mean, while it was definitely obscure, our Reddit friend wasn't too freaked out by this point. She simply asked the patient if she would like to see the hospital priest on staff, to which the patient shook her head no and said, "It's too late for that." Then, a few days later, the patient was in bed, eating her dinner, and started screaming. And so the nurse ran in to find her shouting, "Fire, fire, fire, there's fire everywhere." The patient died a few hours later, and the nurse couldn't sleep that night as she was so freaked out that she'd actually witnessed someone seeing the literal fires of hell. And last up in our number 1 spot today is Saw the Devil. Posted by Reddit user Lola CSD 6 years ago, they start off by explaining that their patient was a 20-year-old who had previously been a gang member, then ended up diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. The patient was very angry at the universe, which the nurse felt sympathy for, considering how young he was when he was dying, but mentioned that he was an incredibly aggressive and angry young man, often spitting in her or his family's faces and calling just about everyone who spoke to him cruel names. His anger only got worse as his condition progressed, but still his family remained by his side. On his last day, the family called in the nurse to the room as he wasn't responding. His eyes were glossed over, his skin cold, and was barely breathing. His mother, in a last attempt to comfort him, whispered to go towards the light, to Jesus, to which the young man came to and shouted, "F your Jesus." Then the nurse said the next part haunted her for weeks. He then slowly turned his head to the left and got the horrific look on his face, as if he was looking at something we couldn't see. And horrified, like in a bad movie, his face contorted and he screamed with his last breath, eyes wide, "Oh shit, oh shit, oh no!" Then made a guttural noise and promptly fell back into the bed and died. I mean, if that doesn't sound like someone seeing hell, then I don't know what does.
Number 10, Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. Now this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and in the information provided to detectives, his wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. Now he pleaded not not guilty by reason of insanity to each of those charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts. Now, he was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted homicide. Now, Peter displayed no emotion as his sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear at the sound of my own gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Now, that is just disgusting and ew. Number 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. Now, during his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. He died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. Now, according to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave you." Now, whether he uttered those short sentences or not, his successors were more than happy to take up the challenge. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee, where he would then dismember them. It has been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A detailed search of his apartment revealed 4 severed heads in his kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in his bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray in the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found, which is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. His last words were, "Christ Jesus came to the world to save all sinners, of whom I am the worst." Number 7. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial slayer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot and robbed 7 of her male clients. Now, she claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, that's incredibly unsettling, and I do not like that she said that at all. Number 6. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, according to group member Susan Atkins, the members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, on March 4th, 1971, during sentencing hearings, Manson trimmed his beard to a fork and shaved his head, telling the media, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Then on March 29th, 1971, the jury sentenced him to to death. Manson, though, died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at a hospital on November 19, 2017. His last words were, "I'm the most famous human being not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that has ever lived." Yeah, you can tell he still had a big ego even while looking into the eyes of death. Number 5. Salvador Ramos. You may not know this man's name, but you do know his crime. On May 24th, 2022, Salvador Ramos and his 66-year-old grandmother had an argument over his failure to graduate from high school, during which he shot her in the face before taking her black 2008 Ford F-150. Ramos, using his Facebook account, sent 3 private messages to a girl from Germany whom he had met online. The first said that he was going to shoot his grandmother, the second said that he had shot his grandmother, and a third, about 15 minutes before the said that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He went to Robb Elementary School, his former school, and fatally 19 students and 2 teachers, while 17 others were injured but survived. Now, details are still fuzzy about what happened, as it took the police forever to get into the building to take Salvador down, but what I could gather is he was in a room and opened the door and said goodnight before officers. In return, the officers back, ending his life. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by ending people's lives and taking advantage of them. Now, he also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. Now, he was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts of taking someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and was on death row. While awaiting his scheduled death, he died on June 7th, 2013 due to health complications, but his last words were, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." All I gotta say is, I hope he doesn't get avenged. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Now, Albert once boasted that his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Westchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it." Now, this is extremely disturbing, and I cannot imagine how her mother felt, and as a result, he was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair, and his last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Which again is disturbing, because did he really think he didn't deserve to die after the horrible crimes he committed? Number 2. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a serial slayer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He's suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." Now, again, that's just plain disturbing, as he had no remorse at all. And coming at number 1 is Jake Berg. In 1949, Jake Berg, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect for those as well. On July 15, 1949, Jake was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the bird hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake bird hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now, the real scary thing about this is that within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to this case did die. So, is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
Kicking off the list at number 10, Sir Isaac Newton. Alright, yeah, we'll start this list off back in the early 1700s. Why not? Let's start crying back in the olden days. Sir Isaac Newton lived until he was 80, and back in the 1700s, living until you're 80, why, that's practically unheard of, right? That's insane. Newton started to experience digestion issues, but come 1727, he blacked out and never woke up again. The man died at 84. His last words were sad, of course, as are all of these on this very sad list that I'm doing, in a hopefully not sad way. But they go as follows. "I don't know what I may seem to the world, but as to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then and finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." What exactly that means, let's all talk about it in the comments. Let's try and decipher that. There we go. Number 9, John F. Kennedy. A little more recent, jumping to the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy was killed while riding in a motorcade. We all know this one, of course. I don't have to go into grim detail about what happened here. He was riding alongside his wife, of course, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and in front of him there was Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. They were all rolling along when Nellie said to John, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome." The president then said back, "No, I certainly can't." And just moments later, that's when he met his fate. Number 8, Alfred Hitchcock. This man went out with a zinger. Classic, what a classic drama queen. Alfred Hitchcock worked alongside famous painters and literary figures throughout history. He's an icon. He teamed up with Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Dorothy Parker, you name it. In his 1945 film Spellbound, Alfred even brought on Salvador Dali, like the real Salvador Dali, to help him with the film's dream sequences, right? He had a vision, he knew what he was doing. He also terrified many people for years to come. It's also a fun one. Hitchcock is known for going great lengths to keep his endings a secret, like Psycho, for example, a 1960s classic. The ad department for the film told audiences to please not give away the ending, as it's the only one they have. That's fun, that's cute. Weirdly mirrors his last words in real life. As he was dying, Alfred said, "One never knows the ending. One has to die to know exactly what happens after death, although Catholics have their hopes." That sounds very Alfred Hitchcocky. Number 7, Steve Jobs. A little more modern, there we go. When I was making this list, I couldn't believe how long it's been since Steve Jobs has passed away. It's been a while. The tech icon's last moments were in 2011. He was surrounded with love. He had beside him his sister Patty, his children, and his partner Lorene. Steve looked above them and said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said "oh wow" 3 times. That's pretty heavy stuff to hear. Steve's last moments were shared furthermore when his sister wrote in his eulogy, "Even now he had a stern, still handsome profile, the profile of an absolutist, a romantic." Number 6, Nostradamus. I predict that you'll hit that thumbs up. That's inappropriate, but we try our best. The astrologer's last words were in itself predictions. And this last prediction he sadly got right. Nostradamus, full name Michel de Nostradam, published a book on prophecies back in 1555, and in it he had 942 pieces of writing. He had these poems that told the future, right? These texts have supposedly hinted towards the JFK attack, meteors hitting Earth, the invasion of France, global warming, you name it. He said some eerie things about such topics, and he also predicted his own death. On paper, he did. It was his last ever prediction. It was July 1st, 1566. His priest said to him, "Until tomorrow," and Nostradamus replied, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." Sadly, he was correct. Number 5, Beethoven. Another icon, another staple in history, the German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. We've recently heard his work in theaters. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange fights the villain with musical notes. He uses these notes. He uses Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. Now we've heard Beethoven in IMAX, right? What a time to be alive. When Ludwig was still alive, he faced many health problems. Hepatitis, jaundice, skin diseases, cirrhosis of the liver, and of course, deafness. When his time came on March 26, 1827, the composer was believed to have said, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over." This is false. This is not true at all. Beethoven's close friend, Anselm Hüttenbrenner, who was very much present during his friend's passing, he said his last words were about the case of red wine that had just been delivered from his publisher. Ludwig's true last words followed, and they were, "Pity, pity, too late." About the wine. Fair. More than fair. It was a little too late. Number 4. Marie Antoinette. Another older one, but I figured I'd go more Victorian for this list, you know? Instead of like recent celebrities, that's only depressing. We don't want to talk about those. During the height of the French Revolution, Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette were both charged with treason. The phrase, "let them eat cake," is often associated with Mrs. Antoinette in this case, but her last words were actually an apology. Not to the people in which they owed it to, but to the executioner whose foot she stepped on whilst approaching the guillotine. Yeah, shows like Game of Thrones make it look easy to say something cool right before your, demise. In reality, I would beg for my life. Looking up at this dude? Yeah, I would plea. I'd be like, please don't do this. I really don't want this to happen. Number 3, Bob Marley. Of course, we have to mention the one and only reggae legend, Bob Marley, okay? Cancer was the reason that this icon met his fate early. The big C, once again. Marley was only 36 years old when he passed away in 1981. Next to him, he had his son Ziggy, and to him he shared the final words. And I think we could all learn a little something here. He said to Ziggy, "Money can't buy life." Yeah, I'll say that again. Money can't buy life. Not happiness, life. Bob Marley's death was so impactful that the Jamaican government turned this sad day into a national holiday. Yeah, that's a great idea. Live some more of that life. Take the day off. Blast some Marley and, you know the rest. Stuff I can't talk about, light some candles, right? That's an ideal way to mourn somebody as impactful as Bob Marley. I'm here for it. Number 2, Giles Corey. Out of the 27 people who had their lives taken away from them during the 1692 Salem witch trials, 19 were hanged, 17 passed away in prison while serving their sentence, and the last victim, Giles Corey, refused to plead either innocent or guilty. And the law at the time states that you can't be tried otherwise, so he did what was ultimately best for him and his family and his estate. The townsfolk laid a heavy board on top of the 81-year-old man during the witch trials and all that nonsense, and then over the course of 2 days, boulders were slowly added, making the weight more and more unbearable. They were hoping that Giles would admit something, either being innocent or guilty, whatever the case, but every time they asked him anything, Giles responded with, "More weight." How epic is that? Extremely brave. This is something like, it sounds easy, but in reality, I would never do this. I would fold immediately. I would be like, this is so hard. But sadly, after 2 days of this torture, Giles passed away. He fought for so long and did what he could, because if he had gone either of the other 2 ways, Giles would have his property taken away from the town. But since he passed away not admitting guilt, he was still in full possession of his estate, which immediately went to his son-in-law. And finally, number 1, Robin Williams. Okay, I wanted to end on one that really hit home for me personally. I try and bring comedy into these lists whenever I can. It's like, cursed dolls that will haunt your family. I'm like, okay, I try and jazz it up a bit. I try and add some physicality to it whenever I can, brighten the mood. Because I was raised watching this man right here. Robin sadly passed away in August 2014. I was 19 at the time. I still remember the day, right? It was the first celebrity death that actually did something to me physically. And I don't mean for that to sound sensitive, but I grew up with this man, right? He was like Hook, Aladdin, robots, so underrated, right? Robin's wife, Susan Schneider Williams, revealed her husband's last words in an interview with ABC. And when the couple was getting ready for bed the night before, his last words were, "Good night, good night." Yeah, I wanted to end on a nice, good, peaceful note instead of something horrible from the 1700s. There we go.
Coming in at number 10, we have Lars Mittank, a very strange story from a man that was just a young dude trying to have some fun. Lars Mittank went down to Bulgaria with 4 friends, and all of them were having a great time. They were getting drunk and watching soccer, but here's the thing with soccer. It can be a very sensitive subject for some people. So there were some guys at this bar that didn't agree with Lars and his friends' opinion on soccer. This caused a massive massive brawl in the bar, and everyone was pretty fine except for Lars. He had a ruptured eardrum from getting hit, and this would roll into more problems. Him and his friends were supposed to fly the next day, but Lars couldn't because of his ear, so his friends had to take off without him. Lars was stuck trying to find another way home, but he started to become extremely paranoid. He thought that men were after him. The last words that anyone heard him say was his mother. He called her and told her that someone was after him. There was footage of him running out of his hotel, but no one knows what happened to the poor young man. Coming at number 9, we have missing in Costa Rica. Back in 2018, a girl named Carla would be in Costa Rica. She sent a message to her family saying things were pretty sketchy here, and those would be the last words that anyone ever heard from her. Carla was down in Costa Rica with her sister-in-law, and things seemed to be going great. The two of them were having tons of fun, but they didn't get flights returning at the same time. Carla's sister-in-law came back early, and Carla was left at her Airbnb alone. That was when she sent this message. The power kept cutting in and out at her Airbnb, and she thought something could go wrong soon. The weird thing is, this isn't the last time someone saw Carla. She reportedly went to the airport and even checked in, but never got on her flight. Someone said they saw her get into a strange car at the airport, and police think that she might have been abducted. Next on the list we have yes. Not a lot of information to go off of when someone just sends you the word yes and then disappears forever. This story goes back to 2017, and it's about Jaden Thompson. He was traveling across the United States with his friend. The two were a couple of young dudes that were out there trying to have a good time, but partway through the trip, Jaden's mother got worried. She hadn't talked to him for a while, and she knew that he was not doing well emotionally. He was having a lot of problems with his father. So his mother tried to contact him, but she couldn't get a hold of him. For an entire day she called and texted, and he never responded. She kept asking if he was okay and where he was, and he later responded with one word, which was yes. It's so annoying when you send someone a novel worth of text and then they give you a one-word answer. Well, Jaden was later reported missing. Apparently him and his friend Lucas, who he was traveling with, got into an argument and Lucas left him on the side of the road. After this, no one has ever seen him. Some people think that Jaden might have been going through some type of paranoia. This is because he was telling people that there was a warrant for his arrest, but there was no such thing. Coming at number 7, we have lost on a hike. Whenever you're going on a hike, you should always bring some friends and a way to contact people. This is a must for me because I have a terrible sense of direction. Well, Robert Goldmeiser would fall victim to his bad sense of direction. In 2016, he went for a hike in New Zealand with a friend, but right at the beginning of the hike, his buddy backed out. Sometimes you look at the mountain and you see how high it is and you realize it's way too much to deal with. Well, Robert went on by himself, and while he was doing this, he was texting his partner. Partway through the hike, he said he was scared, and his partner was texting him back asking him if he was okay. All of a sudden, Robert stopped responding. This is when things got scary. Robert's partner kept trying to contact him, but after a day of silence, he called the police and a search was launched to try and find Robert. The party looked for Robert for an entire day, and right when it looked like there was no hope, he was found. What happened is when he was on the way back on his hike, he got lost and ended up walking in circles through the woods. He had to spend 2 nights in the freezing cold before he was ever found. He would be taken to the hospital and survive this traumatic experience. Number 6 on the list, we have Frederick Valentich. Now for something a little bit more spooky. It's time for an alien abduction story. This has to be one of the most famous abduction stories of all time. Freddie Val was working for the Australian military. He was one of the best pilots. He was known for hitting sick barrel rolls and showing off to all the ladies. I may have made that part up, but this next part is the truth. In 1978, Freddie was in charge of a test flight that should have gone off without a hitch, but partway through the flight, he reported something that was following him. He said that there was something that looked like a flying saucer floating next to his ship. He tried to avoid the strange spacecraft, but no matter where he turned, the thing would keep pace with him and tracked him down. He reported back to base via radio that he had no idea what this thing was, and he eventually said it's hovering and it's not an aircraft. At this point, I assumed that the dude was pooping his little pants, but we will never know because right after he said this, the radio went dead and Freddie Boy disappeared. He was never heard from again, and the people who are really into alien conspiracy theories will tell you that the Australian government has more info on what happened that day, but they refuse to share it with the public. At number 5 on the list, we have Timothy Piston. This was a wild missing person case from back in 2011. Timothy Piston and the rest of his family all traveled from Illinois to Wisconsin. They were all set to spend the weekend at a water park and have a great time. It should have been a great weekend of memories, but it turned out to be a horror show for the entire family. Not long after checking into the hotel, jail, Timothy would go missing and never be seen again. Apparently, one of the last things he said to his mom was asking her for a glass of water. This is something that was all over the news and a massive heartbreak for the entire family. There are so many twists and turns to this case, we could do an entire list just on this case. Coming in at number 4, we have Brandon Lawson. Back in 2013, Brandon Lawson would take off in his truck after getting into a fight with his girlfriend, and that is the only part of the story that sounds normal. Not long after driving away, he had to pull over because he was out of gas, and then he called his brother. He told his brother that he had been chased out of town and people were coming to kill him. This was very strange, and Brandon had a history of drug use, so he might have been having a trip. Well, Brandon then called the police and told him he was being chased through the woods, and then he called his girlfriend and told her he was in the woods bleeding, and then he was never seen again. Coming in at number 3, we have Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson is the man responsible for colonizing the Hudson Bay. He was obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage. If he had found the Northwest Passage, this would have opened trade between Europe and Asia, and he would have been the famed explorer who made it happen. Well, to do this kind of thing, you have to bring a bunch of men with you, and all of them have their own opinions. And to find the Northwest Passage, you have to move through one of the coldest areas on the planet. And they were also trying to do this in 1610. So when it got cold back then, you didn't have heated seats to keep you warm. Well, Henry tried to get his men to push on from Hudson's Bay and find the Northwest Passage, but it turns out that the dudes on board didn't like this plan. They mutinied and took him and the 8 men who wanted to stay with him and put them in a boat in the middle of the Hudson's Bay. They then left them in that boat in the middle of the bay and took off. Apparently Hudson wished them all death before he was never seen again. Obviously this dude is dead now, but no one knows what happened to him after he was left out in the bay. Coming in number 2, we have Cherry Mahan. Cherry went missing in 1985, and since then no one has ever seen her. The last person to ever see her alive was a school bus driver who dropped her off. He said "have a nice day" to her, and she responded "I'll see you later." Her drop off was only 50 feet from her home. For some reason she didn't make it all the way back to her front door. It's suspected that she was kidnapped by someone, but no one knows who could have done this. The case has been open to this day, and in the 30+ years that people have been searching for this girl, the only lead was a blue van that someone saw parked on the street. There was no license plate and no other information on the van, and it has never been tracked down. To this day, no one knows what happened to Cherry. And last on the list, we have Ray Gricker. This man was the district attorney that was going after Jerry Sandusky, but at the time of his disappearance, no one knew this. Ray Gricker was the district attorney of Century County, Pennsylvania, and out of nowhere, one day he disappeared. The last thing anyone heard from him was his girlfriend getting a call from Gricker telling her that he was coming home from work soon. He never showed up, and his car was found with everything taken out of it. The last things that were found in his car was a laptop and phone. Both of these items had been soaked in water, so it was too hard to get any sort of information out of them. It wasn't until after this that it became public knowledge that Gricker had been working on a case to take down Penn State football coach Jerry Sandusky. People think that the university and Sandusky might have gotten word that Gricker was building a case against them and wanted to take him out before things went public. You'd be surprised how much money and power a school like Penn State had.
Number 10. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial killer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Number 9. Robert Charles Towery. Robert Charles Towery ended the life of Robert Jones, a philanthropist who loaned money to him on several occasions and used him as a mechanic. Robert Jones was in his home when Robert Towery asked him to use his phone. Once inside, he pulled a weapon on him and handcuffed him. He then proceeded to take $1,200 and load jewelry, electronics, and other items into his car before he led his victim to the master bedroom at gunpoint. He laid the victim face down on the bed and injected him using a veterinary syringe filled with battery acid. He told the victim the substance would put him to sleep, but he passed away. Robert was arrested and put on death row in Arizona. On March 8, 2012, he was put to death by lethal injection. During Robert's last moments, he apologized to the victim's family and cursed his bad mistakes. His last words were, "I love my family, potato, potato, potato." The potato reference was was a secret message to his nephew, apparently. It's the sound that a Harley-Davidson motorcycle makes when the engine is idle, and it was a way of saying that everything is okay, or was it? I don't know. Number 8. Grover Cleveland Redding. Grover Cleveland Redding believed he was the Prince of Abyssinia and was on a mission to bring his people back to the homeland. He started an anti-government riot, and at some point the Abyssinians started burning US flags. 2 white cops approached them, but the Abyssinians were armed and chased them off. A black cop approached them and he was shot. One Abyssinian burned a flag and quoted it, shouting the following: "As we have destroyed these flags, we are going to destroy your government. Our government is backing us." This provoked the calling of every Southside police district to send 20 men and a commanding officer to the protest. Allegedly, 700 policemen responded in 20 minutes. They stopped the Abyssinians before any more violence. All participants were arrested within a week, and Grover was sentenced to death for starting an anti-government riot in which 2 of his followers were killed. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I have something to say, but not at this time." And I guess we'll never know. Number 7. Thomas Grasso. On December 24th, 1990, Thomas Grasso strangled Hilda Johnson using her Christmas tree lights in her Tulsa home. He stole $8 from her purse, $4 in loose change, and her television set, which he sold for $125. 6 months later, after moving to New York, he ended the life of Leslie Holtz, a man from Staten Island, on July 4th, 1991, and stole his security check. New York detectives investigating the death of Leslie arrested Thomas, and within 2 weeks he had confessed to the police. He first told investigators about the Staten Island killing and then about the death of Hilda Johnson. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years to life on April 21st, 1992 for the death of Leslie, and on September 28th, 1992 he pleaded guilty to the death of Hilda and was sentenced to death in Oklahoma. Although his last meal included 4 dozen steamed mussels and clams, a Burger King double cheeseburger, a half dozen barbecue spare ribs, and 2 strawberry milkshakes, he was disappointed that they substituted spaghetti for SpaghettiOs. Due to this, his final words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Now, not that this is scary necessarily, but you gotta admit, it's messed up. It was his last meal ever and they didn't provide it to him. Number 6. Tom Blackjack Ketchum. Tom Blackjack Ketchum was an American cowboy who later became an outlaw. Blackjack and a group of others were named as robbers of a railway train in 1892 with a large payroll aboard. The second major crime attributed to Blackjack was the death of a neighbor, John N. It's alleged that he was also involved in the disappearance and presumed deaths of Albert Jennings Fontaine and his son Henry Fontaine in early June 1896. Then Blackjack and his brother Sam, and possibly others, robbed a combined store and post office. On July 11th, 1899, the gang, without Blackjack, robbed a train again at Twin Mountain, and on August 16th, 1899, Blackjack, supposedly knowing nothing about the July 11th holdup, single-handedly attempted to rob the same train again at the same place and in the same way that he and Sam and others had robbed it just a few weeks earlier. He was arrested, and at the trial he was convicted of attempted train robbery and sentenced to death. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast." Ironically though, the hanging was botched, with the noose ripping his head clean off when the trap door was retracted. It was said that his body landed with both feet on the ground and remained upright for a short time after. Number 5. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929 in the city of Dusseldorf. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife, and this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In information provided to detectives, his wife explained although she knew her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts, and he was also found guilty on 7 counts of attempted murder. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock in the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Number 4. Georges Jacques Danton. Georges Jacques Danton was a French lawyer and leading figure in the French Revolution. In August 1792, he became the French Minister of Justice and was responsible for inciting the September massacres. In spring 1793, he supported the foundation of Revolutionary Tribunal and became the first president of the Committee of Public Safety. Georges was a key figure in the case of Duamoris. In early October 1793, he left politics but was urged to return to Paris to plead as a moderate for an end to the terror. His continual criticism of the Committee of Public Safety provoked further counterattacks. At the end of March 1794, he made a speech announcing the end of the terror. Within a week, he became embroiled in a scandal concerning the bankruptcy proceedings of the French East India Company and was guillotined by the advocates of the revolutionary terror after accusations of conspiracy towards the enemies of the revolution. On March 30th, the two committees decided to arrest him and he was sentenced to death. He was one member of a group of 15 people beheaded on April 5th, 1794. His last words spoken to his executioner were, "Don't forget to show my head to the people, it's well worth seeing." Number 3. Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop was a German politician and diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1938 to 1945. He became a close confidant of the dictator running Germany at the time, to the disgust of many party members who thought him superficial and lacking talent. He was appointed ambassador to the Court of St. James, the Royal Court of the United Kingdom in 1936, and then Foreign Minister of Germany in February 1938. He did the utmost to support a declaration of war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor and helped facilitate Japan's decision to attack the United States in 1941. He was arrested in June 1945 and was convicted and sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials for his role in starting World War II in Europe and enabling the death of Jewish people. On October 16, 1946, he became the first Nuremberg defendant to be executed by hanging. He reportedly turned to Henry F. Grecki, the prisoner's Lutheran chaplain, before the hood was placed over his head and whispered, "I'll see you again." Number 2. Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a killer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He is suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage to men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all those things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Now, that is just plain disturbing. He had no remorse at all, and it seems like he confessed to an extra death. And coming in at number 1 is Jake Bird. In 1949, Jake Bird, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect in those as well. On July 15, 1949, he was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with me being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now, the real scary thing about this though is within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to his case did die. So is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?